This bear saved a man's life, but no one believed him. What if I told you that a man was saved by a bear? Not by chance, not by accident, but voluntarily. And what if I told you that nobody believed him when he tried to inform the world? This is the real story of the bear that did something that no one can understand, and the man who got lost in a fatal snowfall. Some people refer to it as luck. Some refer to it as fate. However, after learning about what transpired, you could begin to believe in miracles. Some stories are heard, nodded, and forgotten. Then some tales are so implausible, so irrational, that they silence a whole village. One of those tales is this one. It was more than a man surviving in the wilderness. It wasn't just another hiker who had lost his way returning. This was not like the others. This account went against everything people believed to be true about bears, nature, and survival. Daniel Carter wasn't your typical guy. He was a seasoned hiker who was aware of the risks associated with the wilderness. Nothing could have prepared him for what transpired in the Alaskan tundra that winter, even though he had experienced storms and hunger before. People were eager to learn how Daniel survived when he eventually returned to town, whack and frostbitten, but amazingly alive. When did he tell them, though? They chuckled. Did a bear rescue his life? Not possible. Did a bear lead him to safety, share his food, and protect him? Unreal. Daniel vowed fervently that it was real, but nobody took him seriously. Not the rangers from the area, not the reporters for the news, not even his closest companions. Nevertheless, the individual was still alive. But how was he going to explain it? How was he going to prove it? Because something happened that no one was prepared to accept. Far away from society, in the middle of the wilderness, and everything would be different if he was telling the truth. Imagine being in front of a group of people and wanting desperately to tell them the truth, only to have them smirk, shake their heads, and brush it off like a kid's fairy tale. Daniel Carter experienced precisely that. He returned to civilization with a story that shouldn't have been possible after spending days in a terrible snowfall when he was exposed to the kind of cold that kills even the strongest men. People simply refused to believe this story of survival since it was so improbable and went against the laws of nature. The hilarity started when he said, "A bear saved my life." Some referred to him as delirious. Others thought the cold had messed with his mind, and he had dreamed it. Experts gave a headshake. Humans don't benefit from bears, they declared. Predators are bears. They launch an assault. They are not able to save. Daniel, however, was aware of what he saw. He was aware that a bear had done something that no one thought was conceivable when he was at his most desperate, and death was only a breath away. Its warmth had been sensed by him. He had witnessed it guide him to safety. The fact that he was holding the fish dropped at his feet was evidence that he wasn't having hallucinations. However, nobody paid attention, because everything people believed they knew about nature would be incorrect if Daniel's account were accurate. And the truth like that, they couldn't believe it at all. Daniel Carter was more than simply a typical outdoorsy guy with a rucksack. He was designed to survive in the wild. Daniel has spent more time outside at the age of 34 than most people do in their lives. He was a true adventurer who loved the unadulterated beauty of the wilderness, not just a weekend camper. The locations where he felt most alive were the mountains, the rivers, and the thick forests. Daniel had a fascination with venturing into the unknown from an early age. He valued nature in addition to enjoying it. He learned how to track animals, navigate without a compass, create fires in the most difficult situations, and study survival skills. He was the one person you would bet on to survive in the wild. He has trekked through some of the most difficult landscapes throughout the years, including Canada's deep forests and the Rocky Mountains. He had experienced weeks without enough food, encounters with untamed animals, and storms. He always returned, though, stronger, wiser, and more prepared. However, he had no experience that could have prepared him for what was going to unfold in the wilderness of Alaska. Because Daniel had never seen anything like this in all his years, something that would test the bounds of him, something that would cause him to doubt all he believed to be true, and something that nobody would accept. Nature was more than just a location to Daniel Carter. It was his home. He perceived freedom in the woods when others saw it as a huge and unpredictable force. He felt alive in the boundless heavens, the whispering pines, and the towering mountains. Daniel was not afraid of the wild like other people. He knew, admired it. He knew talent, patience, and intelligence were just as important for survival as physical power. When the world turned against him, he had spent years studying how to read the terrain, find water in the driest regions, and construct shelter. Most significantly, he was aware of the straightforward fact that nature is unforgiving of errors. Daniel never took quick cuts because of this. He never depended on luck, carried only what he required, and meticulously planned his travels. More times than he could remember, he had traveled alone through impenetrable rainforests, cold tundras, and scorching deserts. He learned how to adapt, push himself, and thrive on his own from each adventure. For him, being alone in the wild did not equate to loneliness. Peace prevailed. However, there is a distinction between being confined in solitude and deciding to be alone. Daniel had no notion that his abilities wouldn't be sufficient this time when he embarked on his perilous trek into the Alaskan wilderness. He wouldn't be alone this time. No survival book could educate him on what was waiting for him. This was meant to be simply another excursion for Daniel Carter. Packing his luggage, checking his equipment, and embarking on a solo excursion in the Alaskan wilderness was nothing new to him. Nothing out of the ordinary. Another opportunity to escape the world's cacophony and immerse oneself in the splendor of unspoiled nature. The goal was straightforward, a 4-day hike along a secluded track with only snow-capped mountains, freezing rivers, and tall pines as the backdrop. Daniel had brought his emergency radio, packed adequate food, and planned his trip. He was ready for anything, or so he believed. The first day went flawlessly. Clear skies, crisp air, the kind of magnificent landscape that made him remember why he had done this in the first place. He made his camp beneath the stars, his fire blazing in the chilly night air as he strolled through the woodland with ease. There seemed to be nothing unusual. However, nature doesn't forewarn before anything happens. The weather changed on the second day. What began as a little snowfall soon changed into something more hazardous. The wind howled through the trees, the temperature plummeted quickly, and the snow fell with more force than he had ever experienced. It was already too late when Daniel recognized what was going on. His familiar surroundings turned into a never-ending white nothingness as the sky became darker and the storm engulfed his course. He was by himself, lost. He was unaware at the time that the true nightmare was only getting started. Snow was nothing new to Daniel Carter. He had walked fearlessly over frigid terrain and felt the sharp bite of winter's breath. However, it was not like the others. Only a few hours prior, the sky had been clear, and the sun had illuminated the vast Alaskan tundra with long, golden rays. No warning was given. There was no indication that the sky would soon turn against him. However, nature doesn't request permission in the wild. The first snowflakes were soft, almost serene, and melted as soon as they came into contact with his jacket. Then everything changed in a flash. Like a live creature, the wind twisted through the trees, howling. The snow grew heavier, so heavy that the sky was obscured. Everything in view was engulfed by the white emptiness that replaced the once beautiful countryside. The clouds of Daniel's breath were harsh and cold. He could only see a few feet in front of him. His knees became rigid, and his fingers numb as the cold sliced through his clothing. The road underfoot was gone. His ribs throbbed with his heartbeat. He was getting lost. The map, useless. There was no visibility, and the scariest aspect, he had no refuge nor way out. Only a merciless storm that was getting worse by the moment. The vastness of Alaska was encroaching on him. Daniel Carter realized that he might not survive for the first time in his life. Daniel Carter knew exactly where he was at one point. He was nowhere the next day. Everything, including his tracks, was covered by the dense, blinding waves of snow. Hoping to go back the way he had come, he turned around. However, nothing was present. No trail, no well-known landmarks, a sea of white that goes on forever in all directions. His chest grew constricted. He couldn't find his way. Daniel had experienced hardships in the past, but there was more to this. Any trace of his origins was erased by the unrelenting snowstorm. Each tree has the same appearance. None of the paths led anywhere. He took his map out. No point. The surroundings had become a haze that he could no longer recognize. His compass wildly spinning, as though nature itself would not lead him. His jacket was sliced through like blades by the frigid, merciless wind that shrieked across the woodland. He had tense fingers. The cold burned his face. His body pleaded with him to pause, to take a break. But the truth was known to him. To stop was to die. Step by step he pushed himself ahead, but it felt like a trap in every direction. Was he venturing more into the woods? Was he repeating himself? Panic began to set in. He made an effort to ignore it, but the fact that he had no escape was suffocating. What's the worst? Nobody was even aware of his disappearance. Daniel Carter was no stranger to difficulties. On previous hikes he had experienced fatigue, hunger, and even injury. However, this was not like the others. There was no discomfort here. This was a matter of survival. It wasn't just cold anymore. It was ruthless, biting, and profound. His feet slowed as it sank into his bones, numbing his fingertips. His muscles were rigid and lethargic, and his boots felt heavier with each step. Then there was the appetite. With hardly functioning fingers, he reached into his pack and took out the last of his meal, a tiny protein bar. Just one taste. 2. It had vanished. That was it. The knowledge struck with a jolt. He had 4 days scheduled. The storm had put everything off balance, and it was only day 2. He was running low on supplies. He gasped in short breaths. He required warmth, shelter, right now. Where, though? Everything had the same appearance. The forest was now a swirling, white horror due to the blizzard. He was losing heat more quickly than he was producing it. He was aware of what would happen next. First, the violent, uncontrollable shivering. Then came fatigue, a terrible cold trick that lulls its victims to sleep. Sleep was also a sign of death. Daniel tried to pump blood into his fingers by clenching his fists. He needed to keep going. He needed to find shelter, since if he didn't, he would be buried in the Alaskan tundra before dawn. Daniel Carter had always relied on his emergency radio, even though he was aware of how harsh the wilderness might be. It was his lifeblood, the link between him and the world. And now, it had died. A new type of anxiety took hold as he pressed the power button and heard nothing but stillness. Not being lost is a dread, not the fear of starvation, however the anxiety of knowing that nobody was approaching. The battery ought to have held up. Before the trip he had examined it. Yesterday it had operated flawlessly. Now, however, when he most needed it, nothing. No signal, no static, nothing except silence. Daniel clenched his jaw, shook the gadget, and pressed each button. Nothing. Perhaps the transmission was being disrupted by the storm, he told himself. When the weather improves, perhaps it might work once more. But he knew the truth in his heart. He was by himself. Not a rescue squad, no search crew. Nobody was even aware of his disappearance. His tracks had been washed away by the rain, and now the radio had eliminated his last opportunity to communicate with anyone. It was up to him if he wanted to live. He pushed the useless radio back into his pack while clenching his jaw. His meal was gone, his body was cold, and everything around him was being engulfed by the snow. And for the very first time since the start of this nightmare, Daniel knew what it was like to feel powerless. Daniel Carter was worn out. The constant snow whipping across his face caused his legs to hurt, his body to tremble, and his vision to become blurry. The cold was winning. He continued walking, but it felt more difficult. Although his intellect begged him to press on, the increasing numbness in his limbs revealed another reality. He wouldn't be around for much longer. Then he noticed it. A shadow. It crept between the trees, black and tall, barely discernible through the swirling snow. In his chest, his heart jumped. There's a visitor, a hero, another hiker, a ranger? It must have been. Daniel's voice sounded feeble, yet his broken lips parted. "Hey, come on over here." The shadow remained silent. Slowly, methodically, it moved just beyond his field of vision. His feet dragged through the deep snow as he pushed himself onward. Desperate to get their attention, he waved his arms. "Please, I need assistance." Still no answer. However, his gut turned into a chilly knot as he approached. There was a problem. This was not a human figure. It was too big, too general, too strange. Daniel's throat tightened with each breath. He suddenly came to the realization. This person wasn't a hero. Something else was involved, something far more hazardous. Daniel's heart stopped beating. He finally noticed it as the shadow approached, entering the dim, frigid brightness of the storm, and his blood froze. There was no rescuer. It was not another hiker. It was a bear, a huge grizzly bear with thick fur and at least 800 pounds of raw muscle, stared at him with its dark eyes. In the icy air, its breath misted as snow stuck to its garment. It was only a few feet away, silent, still, observing. Daniel's intuition told him to flee. But he was wiser. To run was to die. He breathed in weak, short gasps. He knew it was pointless, but his fingers jerked toward the knife fastened to his belt. No human was able to repel a grizzly. It would be over in a matter of seconds if it charged. The bear took a deep breath and stepped forward, its massive paws digging into the snow. Daniel balled his hands, making himself remain motionless and not respond. "Don't panic." was the message he took away from every survival course he had ever taken. Stay put. Avoid looking directly at them. How could he not, though? The wind howled through the trees as the storm raged all around them. But only he and the beast felt the silence of the planet at that moment. Daniel was no stranger to the outdoors. He had experienced fatigue, hunger, and cold. However, he had never encountered death in this way. And death was looking directly at him right now. Daniel's whole body is immobilized. He was not breathing. He didn't flinch. He dared not make a single movement. He could have been killed instantly by the bear because it was so close. He could see the heavy, sluggish rise and fall of its chest, and the frost sticking to its thick fur. Its breath curled into the icy air like smoke and came out in deep, hazy huffs. The enormous beast loomed above him, its strong body obstructing the snow's swirling motion behind it. His mind was racing, trying to figure out how likely he was to survive, but there was no possibility. It would be over before he could even react if the bear charged. His blade? Useless. His physique? Too weak, too chilled to run. Though he knew better, every muscle in his legs begged him to run, to escape into the storm. To run was to die. The bear looked directly into his deep, dark eyes. It sniffed the air and lifted its head a little. Then it advanced a step. Daniel felt his heart hit his ribs hard. It was this. This was when it would happen. Every nerve in his body was ready for the assault's pure ferocity as he braced himself. At that moment, time seemed to drag on forever as his breath caught and his fingers twitched. However, after that, the bear took an unexpected action. It ceased, not in an attack warning manner, not in the sense that a predator assesses its victim. It simply gazed at him. Then it turned away from him without snarling, without growling, and turned to leave. Slowly, deliberately, step by step, vanishing into the approaching white storm. Daniel's breathing became labored. What just took place? How come it didn't attack? How come it didn't kill him? Is a grizzly bear abandoning a simple kill? It was illogical. This was all illogical. Then Daniel saw something much more bizarre. Only a few steps ahead, the bear had paused once more. It was waiting, too, awaiting him. Daniel's breath came in short, jagged gasps as he stood motionless. His mind cried out for him to run and get as far away from the bear as he could. However, he didn't, because the bear wasn't going anywhere. It had turned aside, its great body taking steady, purposeful strides through the deep snow. The beast proceeded slowly, unfazed by the storm, despite the howling wind all around them. It then came to a halt, not too far in the future, just enough to see through the snowstorm. Daniel squinted his eyes. Was this a ruse? Was the bear making a full circle? Was it awaiting the ideal opportunity to strike? His instincts begged him to remain where he was, to let it vanish into the storm, and to find another route. But something didn't feel right. There was no stalking going on. It wasn't a hunting trip. It wasn't acting in any way like a predator. It was waiting. A few painful seconds went by. Then it moved once again, a couple more steps forward, go slowly and steadily. Then it ceased once more. Daniel's entire body tensed as he swallowed forcefully. It nearly seemed to be urging him to follow. No, that was crazy. That's not what a natural bear would do. Not possible. However, Daniel was aware that he had two options. Stay put and let the storm freeze you to death, or make the one decision that saved his life. His mind may quarrel with his body's decision. Daniel trailed the bear into the storm, cautiously keeping a safe distance. Daniel felt as though every move he made was a gamble. Was this the worst thing he had ever done? Or was this his last opportunity? Years of wilderness survival had sharpened his instincts, telling him that this wasn't normal. The bears didn't take the lead. None of the bears waited. Humans were not spared by bears. Nevertheless, here he was, after one. The wind sliced through his clothing like 1,000 small daggers as the storm raged all around them. Even though his legs were heavy and his fingers were tight, he made himself move. The bear continued to move forward, pushing through the heavy snow with effortless strength, without once turning around or acknowledging him. Daniel didn't approach. The beast may turn against him with a single misstep or abrupt change. Perhaps it was teasing him. Perhaps it was taking him away from distractions to a spot where it would kill him. His breath mixed with the icy air in irregular breaths. What option did he have, though? If you stayed behind, you would perish in the storm. Minutes went by, an hour perhaps. The cold warped and stretched time. Fear and reason were at odds in his mind. The bear then abruptly stopped. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest till he almost stumbled. What caused it to stop? He could hardly see through the snow, but then he saw it. A shadowy gap between the stones, a cavern, a place to stay. His icy body cried out for warmth. However, his mind was unable to process what had just transpired. He had been guided to safety by the bear. However, why? Daniel was gasping for air, and his thoughts were racing as he stood at the cave's entrance. Behind him, the wind howled a merciless force that had almost killed him. But there was a place to stay. His instincts were still telling him to keep his guard up. So he paused. A few feet away, the bear had halted, its massive body half hidden by the whirling snow. It didn't approach him or compel him to enter. It had just brought him here. Why? Daniel wasn't certain whether the bear had always lived in the cave, or if it had just happened upon it while traveling. In any case, the message was unmistakable. This was his opportunity. His only hope is for survival. He moved forward slowly and ducked inside. The immediate relief was tremendous. An unsettling quiet took the place of the howling wind. He was protected from the lethal cold by the cave's massive walls, which contained warmth. Exhaustion and exposure caused his body to shiver violently, but his intellect was suddenly more concentrated and keen. Before he succumbed to hypothermia, he needed to relax, warm up, and dry his garments. Anticipating that the bear would be gone, he turned back toward the door. However, it wasn't. It watched him with dark eyes as it stood just outside. Daniel's heartbeat accelerated. Was this the start of the true danger, or had he just been spared by this thing, this huge, untamed predator? Daniel sat with his back to the chilly stone wall of the cave, attempting to make sense of the impossibility. As he rubbed his icy hands together for warmth, his breath remained erratic due to the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He was still alive. He wasn't alone, though. The bear stood still at the cave's entrance, staring at him with its dark eyes. Daniel felt his heart hammer his ribs. Was this a ruse? Had he been dragged here by the bear only to be cornered, with no way out? Neither of them moved for what seemed like forever. Only the distant noise of the storm outside, with the snow whirling fiercely through the air, could be heard. The bear then performed something that made Daniel's spine tingle. It veered away from him and lumbered slowly in the direction of the cave's far end. It thudded heavily, dropped to the ground, curled up a little, and rested. Daniel blinked hardly at all. Was this thing for real? It didn't snarl. It failed to charge. He was not chased away by it. He would have been viewed as an intruder in its den and a threat by any other grizzly. However, this one, his presence, was accepted. His instincts begged him to remain vigilant, and his body continued to tense. However, another thought began to creep in. Perhaps, just possibly, this bear didn't mean to harm him. Perhaps it had merely wanted to assist. Daniel was still shaking from the cold as he sat in the dark cave. But he could only think of one thing. He had been brought here by this bear, this great, untamed predator, and it had saved his life in the process. The cave's warmth began to eventually permeate into his freezing flesh, causing his fingers to tremble as he wrapped his arms around himself. He would still be out there, frozen to death in the blizzard if it weren't for the bear. A peculiar surge of emotions crashed over him as he came to terms with it. Did it happen by accident? Had he just been fortunate enough to follow the bear as it made its way back to its den? But why hadn't it attacked him if that were the case? How come it hadn't chased him away? What had caused it to pause, wait for him? The reasoning didn't make sense. This was all illogical. With a sharp exhale, Daniel's breath froze in the chilly air. He had been in the forest for years, learning about survival and animal behavior. Bears don't do this, he knew. He glanced at the beast. Its enormous body remained motionless at the far end of the cave, breathing steadily and slowly. He did not frighten it. It didn't have to occupy this area, but it had. His heart thumped. This was no accident. This bear had saved him somehow, for whatever reason. In the cave, time flowed differently. The storm continued to rage outside, day after day, the wilderness becoming a frozen wasteland due to the howling winds and constant snowfall. But something unexpected was taking place inside the cave. In the gloomy silence, it never occurred to Daniel that he would be living side by side with a bear. But here he was, breathing, alive, and not by himself. He hardly slept the first night. Every deep breath and fur rustling from the beast filled his weary body with terror. His instincts warned him that he was always in danger, and that the bear might decide it no longer wanted a visitor in its refuge at any time. However, the assault never materialized. By the second day, Daniel pushed himself to stretch his tense limbs, get more exercise, and regain his strength. Nothing was done by the bear. It seemed to have accepted his existence without even acknowledging him. By the third day, he was observing it out of curiosity rather than terror. It was more than simply a beast. It had a rhythm and a way of being. It would escape into the storm for hours at a time, only to return hours later with its hefty paws leaving deep impressions on the cave floor and its fur coated with fresh snow. And gradually, Daniel's terror changed. Not yet, it wasn't trust. However, it was something, an odd silent comprehension. In this harsh, freezing world, somehow, together man and beast had survived. Daniel has dedicated his life to mastering wilderness survival skills. However, nothing in his entire experience could account for what was presently taking place. Each morning, as the tiniest glimmer of dawn filtered through the outer storm, the bear would get up, stretch, and leave the cave without a word. It didn't make a sound or linger. It simply departed, and the light came back every evening when it had nearly gone out. Daniel initially believed that this was his opportunity. Perhaps he ought to go. Perhaps he ought to run. Where, though? Everything had been submerged in a sea of white due to the storm. There was only unending snow and bitter cold, no trail, no direction, no markers. Thus he remained. What about the bear? It was never aggressive at all. It never once snarled, swiped, or approached him. It felt almost protective. Daniel had anticipated antagonism and the bear reminding him that he was an intruder. Rather, it came back every night without even a worried look. Why? Was it just putting up with him? Or was it something else? Why had this great thing brought him here? Why had it permitted him to remain for some deeper, innate reason? He had nothing to say. But in the back of his mind, as he watched the bear return to the cave, its labored breathing piercing the stillness, when it came close, he began to feel safer. Over the last few days, Daniel had come to terms with a lot of things that were illogical and beyond his previous comprehension. He had come to terms with the fact that a bear had guided him to safety, that his presence in its cave had been tolerated. That creature came and went without violence, as though it knew he posed no threat. However, what followed completely dispelled all of his preconceived notions about the outdoors. It was another cold, terrible night. Outside, the wind rattled through the entrance of the cave, howling like a wounded beast. Daniel sat close to the back, slouched, hungry, and tired. He was becoming weaker. His stomach no longer rumbled, it just hurt, empty and hollow. As usual, the bear came back, squeezing inside the cave while its enormous body trembled from the cold. However, this time, it didn't come up empty. As the bear lumbered forward and dropped something at his feet, Daniel's breath caught in his throat. A fish, new, not hurt. For an instant he simply gazed. What he was seeing was too much for his mind to comprehend. This was not feasible. This is not what animals do. He grabbed for it with trembling, numb fingers, as though touching it would make it go. However, it didn't. It was a real fish. He had gotten it from the bear. Daniel took a deep breath. His throat was dry, and his lips were cracked. Why? Was he viewed as a cub by the bear? As a defenseless thing that needs attention? Was this an accident or what? Is it a coincidence? Or was this a more significant issue? As he looked into the bear's deep black eyes, his heart raced. In his life, for the first time, everything Daniel believed to be true about the wild was called into doubt. Not because he was chilly, but because he couldn't believe it. Daniel sat there, frozen. The icy scales of the fish pressed on his fingertips as it lay in his palms. He could hardly understand it. He had been fed by this bear, not pursued him, did not chase him off. He had been saved by it. He gazed up at the enormous beast slowly, a knot forming in his throat. With its enormous body at ease yet alert, the bear had taken up residence in its typical location close to the cave's entrance. It didn't wait for him to give the fish back. It had no expectation of reciprocation. All it had done was give. The norms of the wild, which Daniel had spent years understanding, had been broken one by one ever since he first encountered this bear. Most men are not led to the shelter by bears. Bears don't just give up their territory. Furthermore, humans do not receive food from bears. Nevertheless, here he was. He was alive, protected, and now, for the first time in days, holding food. His throat constricted. It had evolved from a wild beast. He had nothing against this beast. It wasn't merely an observer. It saved his life. As he took his first taste of the fish, his hands shook and his ravenous body began to warm up. It was not his strength that had allowed him to live this long. This bear was the reason he had survived. Daniel realized that his perspective on the world would change forever. Something changed on the morning after he had been lost for what seemed like an eternity. There was a strange silence when Daniel woke up. No roaring wind. There isn't any icy cold hurrying through the cave's opening. Nothing but quiet. The storm had finally broken for the first time in days. He stood up carefully, his limbs hurting from the cold and hunger of the previous days. His breath curling in the cool morning air, he moved toward the entrance of the cave. His boots crunched on the frozen snow as he stepped outside. Previously a whirling mass of white rage, the sky was now clear. Overhead, pale blue extended, the icy wasteland softly illuminated by the sun. He could see for the first time in days. Much of the terrain had been buried by the never-ending snowfall, turning it into a sea of white. But there was direction once more beyond the snow-capped peaks and tall woods. He was able to locate his residence. Daniel turned back to the cave, where the bear was still sleeping, its enormous body sunk into the darkness. No one would believe what it had done. He had been saved by it. His throat constricted. He was unable to articulate what had transpired here, or the bond he had developed with this creature. After a brief moment of hesitation, he took a step forward. Then he muttered, "Thank you," in the tiniest voice, and he started walking home for the first time in days. Daniel remained motionless as he stood at the entrance to the cave, his boots digging into the recently fallen snow. His body was urging him to leave, to seize the opportunity and return to civilization before he was caught in another storm. But he was held there by something. The bear. This enormous beast had done the unimaginable for days. It had guided him to safety, put up with him, and even fed him. Daniel wouldn't be here today without it. And it was time to go now. His eyes strayed to the bear's position inside the cave, its massive body hunched down and breathing steadily and slowly. It did not stir or respond. It might have been known previously. Perhaps it knew that this was farewell in its way. In his throat, Daniel swallowed the lump. How do you express gratitude to something that shouldn't comprehend? How do you thank a creature that disregarded all of nature's laws, instincts, and expectations? He inhaled deeply before speaking in a voice that was almost audible above a whisper. "I'm grateful." The words didn't seem like enough for what had transpired here. But he had nothing else. The bear remained still. It stayed motionless, its breath gently vaporizing in the chilly air. Daniel turned and left after saying that. He moved away from the cave, the life he had almost lost, and the monster who had saved it with every step. Weak and frostbitten, but alive, Daniel staggered into town. His face was sunken from tiredness. His lips were split, and his garments were frozen solid. It felt like the body was barely holding itself together with each stride. People paused and gazed. Nobody had anticipated seeing him again. Lost in a devastating storm that no one could have survived, he had been gone for days. His conditions were significantly worse than those of hikers who had vanished. He ought to have been listed among the missing persons. Nevertheless, here he was. Someone hurried over to him, covering his icy shoulders with a heavy coat. A second voice cried out for assistance, once only a stopover on his journey. The small village suddenly felt like a planet away from his previous location. He was led by warm hands into a building where his numb skin was burnt by the abrupt surge of heat. A physician examined his hands and feet while muttering about severe exposure, dehydration, and frostbite. Daniel, though, wasn't paying attention, because his thoughts were still in the cave, while they were talking and marveling at his survival. Standing in front of the bear that saved his life, still in the forest. He should have died in the storm. He ought to have been completely engulfed by the wild, however it didn't. And despite his best efforts, he couldn't get the question out of his head. Would anyone believe what transpired? People gathered in shock as soon as the news got out. The man they believed dead, Daniel Carter, was back. Locals peered at him, covered in blankets, his face pallid, his hands shaking from tiredness, and whispered, their eyes wide with amazement. He was still alive, despite his ravaged physique and sunken eyes. Someone murmured, "How did he survive?" Another person shook his head and remarked, "He was lost in the storm for days." No one returns from that. Rumors are quick to spread. Search teams had already given up hope. Anyone trapped in the storm would not have survived a single night, because it had been so vicious and unforgiving. Even though he was frostbitten, he was still moving, as though he had accomplished an impossible feat. Simultaneously, 100 queries were posed. How did you locate a place to stay? What did you consume? Have you been rescued? With a sharp gulp, Daniel's thoughts were racing. How was he going to explain it? If he told them the truth, would they believe him? That he had not been able to find refuge on his own, that he hadn't resisted his defeat, that a bear was responsible for his life. The concept alone sounded ridiculous. He paused, observing the familiar expressions of those around him who were seeking an explanation but not the truth. Because of the truth, nobody would accept it. With a steaming cup of tea in his hands and blankets wrapped around him, Daniel sat by the fire. His body had come back from the woods. However, his thoughts remained there, still in the cave, standing in front of the enormous beast that had committed the unimaginable. The villagers were all around him, interested, inquisitive, and ravenous for his tale. One of them leaned over to inquire, "Daniel, what happened out there? What kept you alive?" Daniel paused. How could he possibly explain it? However, he had to. He had to be honest with them. So he did. He told them about his experience of being lost during the storm and how the frigid wind almost killed him. He talked about the time he believed he was going to die. Until he noticed it. The bear. Heads tilted, eyes widened. People paid attention. Then he revealed to them the part they didn't want to believe, the part that nobody had anticipated. There was no attack by the bear. He was not pursued by it. It took him. It took him to safety. It was in the same cave with him. The bear had fed him, which was the last detail that caused the room to quiet down. There was silence for a minute. Then there was laughter. Initially, soft, then it gets louder. Someone sneered. "Come on, Daniel, a guy being saved by a bear. That doesn't occur." Another said, "You were most likely having hallucinations. The effects of starvation on the brain are strange." A few looked at each other doubtfully. Others simply brushed him aside. Suddenly their faith in his story vanished as soon as it did. Nobody took him seriously. The rangers, number not his pals, not even the people who hoped for him to return safely. His survival was a miracle in their eyes. But why? Not possible. Daniel's throat constricted as he glanced around the room. But he knew in his heart. It was authentic. He wouldn't be here to tell the story at all if it weren't for that bear. Daniel had experienced the scariest days of his life. Lost in a storm that should have killed him, freezing and starved. He had been on the verge of death. Nevertheless, he was present, alive. The truth, the impossible truth, was all he had just told them. That a bear had rescued him, guided him to safety, allowed him to use its cave, and even provided food. What was their reaction? They chuckled, first, A laugh. Then there was raucous laughter. One man laughed and said, "A bear saved you? Daniel, hurry up. That isn't feasible." Another person shook their head and remarked, "They don't save people. They murder them." Another person quipped, "Are you certain you didn't just imagine it? Perhaps the cold affected your mind." Daniel's jaw tightened. They weren't even thinking about it. They weren't even making an effort to comprehend. An older man smirked and remarked, "Perhaps it was a dream, or perhaps you were extremely fortunate and simply believed that a bear had aided you." Daniel felt sick to his stomach. He was aware of what he saw. He was aware of what had occurred. They wouldn't believe him, though, no matter how many times he said it. Not because it was a false story, but because they weren't prepared to believe the news. And all of a sudden, Daniel understood. It made no difference what he said, because they believe that bears do not save people. And that wouldn't alter at all. The skepticism persisted even after the laughing subsided. People were looking for facts. They desired something that made sense to them, something logical. As a result, Daniel's claim was immediately discounted by park rangers and wildlife specialists. One ranger shook his head and remarked, "Daniel, bears don't help humans. They simply don't operate that way." Another said, "Grizzlies are territorial. You were within its boundaries. It was already a miracle if you weren't killed. But giving you food, taking you to safety? Number that is not their practice." Daniel did not argue, but he did listen. What was the purpose? They cited decades of studies and survival manuals. "Bears are wild animals, not protectors," they informed him. That he was fortunate not to have been mauled. He might have misunderstood what happened. That his judgment had been impaired by his weakness. All the answers, save the important ones, were in their possession, since Daniel was aware of something that others were not. It was his life. In front of the beast, he had stood, had pursued it through the storm. It had been in a cave with it. It dropped at his feet and held the fish, had survived because of it. They could call it luck. They could call it a hallucination. They could say whatever they pleased. Ultimately, though, none of them showed up. They didn't even glance into the bear's eyes, and none of them would ever comprehend what Daniel had come to know for sure. The wild isn't always merely mean. There are moments when it is merciful. Years passed, but Daniel never forgot. The world moved on. People ceased making fun of his story and inquiring about his survival. They attributed it to chance, insanity, and an unprovable factor. Daniel, though, he was unable to move on, as he was aware that it was genuine. He was lured back to the wilderness long after the frostbite had healed. His weight had returned, and he had resumed his regular life, to endure. He visited the forests of Alaska whenever he could, hiking along ancient paths and exploring the deep, unexplored wilderness where few ventured. Looking, I'm hoping, the cave was still there. Untouched, empty, lifeless. Snow had reclaimed its entrance. Time had erased the footprints. But Bear was gone. Searching for that great, recognizable figure, he studied the mountains, the frozen riverbanks, and the tall pines. He never saw it, though, not once. Had it changed? Had it vanished, never to be seen again, into the boundless wilderness? Or had it just fulfilled its purpose, preserve him, then disappear? Daniel secretly wondered if the bear had ever been genuine, or was there another reason? Something that showed up just when he needed it, and departed when it was no longer needed. He may never find out. Years later, however, he still found himself waiting, looking for snow, and observing trees whenever he ventured into the forest, because, if it existed, this was the last time he wanted to see it. It was as if the bear had never existed, but he knew it had. He had followed its enormous footprints through the deadly storm, felt the warmth of its presence in the frozen night, and held the fish it had dropped at his feet. It had been real, had it not? Sometimes doubt crept into his mind, whispering things the others had said. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was starvation. Perhaps cold had warped reality. Daniel never stopped searching. But the bear was gone. Every time he returned to the wilderness, he scanned tree lines, followed meandering rivers, and even went back to the cave where he had once stood on the precipice. But he knew deep down that the bear wasn't just any animal. It was meant to find him, to guide him to safety, to make sure he survived. And then it went away. Not because it was afraid, not because it had lost interest, but because it had served its purpose. Daniel sighed as he looked out over the endless snow-covered ridges, the same land that had almost engulfed him. Perhaps the bear had always been a part of the wilderness, something that belonged to the wild, something untamed and mysterious, something that was never meant to be seen again, something that was never meant to stay. Maybe it was meant for only one thing, and that was to save him. What do you think, then? Did Daniel find that cave by chance? Did he just happen to run into a bear that, in defiance of reason, spared his life instead of killing him? Or was there something bigger? Daniel himself was never able to find the solution. All he knew was that he ought to have perished there. He should have been swept away by the storm. His body should have been robbed of life by the cold. Nevertheless, he lived, due to a bear, not a companion, not another hiker, not a rescue squad. His sole hope was a monster that ought to have posed the biggest harm to him. Was it merely an instinctive animal behavior, or was it something else entirely, a power beyond our comprehension? An act of kindness from the natural world itself? We might never find out. However, there is no denying that nature is more than just cruel. Occasionally, in its vast, wild wilderness, it demonstrates mercy in ways beyond our comprehension. Do you think miracles happen? Do you believe that Daniel's survival was purely coincidental? Or do you think there was more going on? Something we might never know for sure. Tell me in the comments below. Please share your thoughts with me. Share this tale with someone if it touched you or caused you to consider the boundaries of fate, nature, or the inexplicable events that mold our lives. We all need to hear a narrative that tells us that even the most impossible things could happen. Before you leave, don't forget to subscribe for more amazing true stories that will make you reevaluate your assumptions. For what reason? There are many mysteries in it, and occasionally the most outrageous tales are the real ones.